it's the start of a new year, and I know as creative people, it can be really tempting to jump into that biggest, most exciting project on the endless to-do list of things we're definitely going to get done in the new year. But I thought this January it would be nice to start with a small, simple project. Instead of doing what I usually do, which would be going for the most insane, eye-catching, crazy idea that I have with all this new excitement for the new year, only to kind of trudge through it for the first month or two and then be so glad that it's done that I don't want to touch any of my craft projects for at least another month or two. So instead of doing that, I think it would be nice today to ease ourselves into the new year and into the new year crafts by attempting to create something that's more of a gateway to the genre that I'm really interested in exploring this year. Which brings us into today's video. Hi, my name is Lana. If you don't know me, I am a second year costume student at UAL Wimbledon in London. I'm studying costume interpretation, and my primary focuses are usually historical costuming, fantasy, and various heritage handcrafts. And today I'm excited to take you guys with me on my first project of the new year, which will be, hopefully, I haven't completed it yet, an 1847 bustle pad from a knitting pattern that I found on an archive site. I think it was Project Gutenberg, yes. And the book, I will have it linked below, as well as the Ravelry page that I found it on. It is called The New Guide to Knitting and Crochet. I'll have a picture right here. So this book has a load of really interesting and particularly useful patterns from the 1840s, which is what really drew me to it. However, in classic 19th century knitting pattern style, there are very few pictures. There's a lot of finish in the usual way style wording. And while it is a fairly simple pattern, I will say it is not a beginner pattern if you've never knit anything before. Definitely knit a scarf or a hat or anything with maybe a YouTube video on it first, and then come back to this. But it's still a very friendly project for beginner knitters who know a little bit of the terminology and have a couple pairs of knitting needles in their stash, or are really excited to take on a challenge that will be a really good talking piece, I would say, because while wearing it, it's not easy to talk about because a bustle pad in the 1840s would have been covered in 2 to 3 layers of petticoats. But if you're knitting it, it's going to be very fun to take places and tell people about a knitted bustle pad from the 1840s. So a few things about the pattern. I will put it right here, I think. Yes, so that you can see exactly what we're working with. So you're casting on 60 stitches and creating a ribbing as the upper edge of your bustle pad piece. Then you're taking the larger size needles and knitting 30 rows. And then you repeat that with the same 60 inches of width, but for a shorter bit. So instead of 30 rows, you move to 26 rows, and the third is only 18 rows. So we're having sort of a tiered scenario, and that will create your bustle pad. And at the end, you'll have a bustle pad, which looks like this. Now, if you're paying really close attention, you might have noticed I skipped over a part of the directions. And that is because I am so confused. I am filming this having not completed the bustle pad yet. I have not done the knitting for it. And I've been researching for hours trying to figure out what exactly is meant by this specific part of the text. Knitting 30 rows, putting the wool twice round the pin. So I'm going to take you through now what I think this means, everything I've been researching, trying to figure out what this wording is calling for. However, if you do just want to get into the actual knitting process, start to finish, I'll tell you can skip over to here. And you can just go watch the pretty parts after I figured out exactly how this pattern works. But for anyone who's interested in a little bit of knitting history and knitting terminology from the Victorian era, let's get into this. So the Ravelry entry for this pattern has 2 completed projects. However, neither of them say anything or put to use this wording, putting the wool twice around the pin, as the bustle can be completed just using straight garter stitch to a fully logical extent. And the second project is based off the instructions of the first person's project, and the first person's project disregarded this wording here because it is hella confusing and there's no reason for it. But we're going to figure it out now. So the first thing I thought when I saw this was putting the wool twice around the pins could possibly mean they want you to yarn over before you do every knit stitch, so just knit one, yarn over, knit one, yarn over, which made sense when I didn't think too deeply about it, because you'll see, like, on ruffly edges of baby clothes, it's one of the methods in which you can create that ruffle if you're not starting from the bottom up. If you start from the top down, you can create the ruffle really quickly by just exponentially increasing the amount of stitches that you have. So if you're doing yarn over, knit one, yarn over, knit one, then you create a really cute little flouncy ruffled edge. However, think about this for 30 more seconds. I didn't. If you knit 30 rows and you are doubling the amount of loops in each row, by row 10, you're going to have 60,000 rows. So I don't think that's quite what they're calling for. Even though a ruffled bustle makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, here's an extant photo of a ruffled bustle. It's absolutely a common thing of the era. But no, that makes no sense in the exact way they've worded it. So what could be going on instead? Double knitting. But not the current method of double knitting that we think of, where you're doing like color work. That's just the same thing, but in inverted colors on the other side. You see it a lot for scarves and such. Not double knitting for the purpose of color work, but an older form of double knitting, which multiple knitting manuals from the 19th century reference and give directions for, which I will put an example here of double knitting directions, and we can read that together. I'll pull it up on my screen. So from the Ladies Knitting and Netting book by Miss Watts, we see, bring the wool forward, slip one stitch, pass the wool back, knit one stitch with the wool twice round the needle. And then in the Knitter's Friend, we see another description of double knitting, which says, having done as many plain stitches as you require for the edge, which would be the ribbing that we have at the top of our bustle pad, in our scenario, not for the specific instruction, bring the wool forward, slip a stitch, pass the wool back, knit one, putting the wool twice over the pin, and repeat. So, two separate instructions, and at the very end of that instruction is knit one, putting the wool twice over the pin. And the final nail in the coffin for me, I think, is specifically this description of double knitting from the Comprehensive Knitting book by Esther Copley. So it says, double knitting, let's scooch over here so I can put it here. Double knitting, so called on account of its forming a double texture as if lined with a separate article and combined at the edges. The texture throughout, though thick, is loose. So if you were double knitting in the modern day, it wouldn't have the looseness because you're not double wrapping that thread, right? And is adapted to purposes which warmth and softness rather than elegance of appearance, such as blankets, petticoats, drawers, protectors for the chest, etc. So that kind of seals the deal for me. It's not meant to be a pretty outward stitch in the way that these directions are written. It is going to add a plushness to an underlayer. And thus, because I cannot find any other reason why this would be done, I believe that the knitted bustle from the 1847 knitting manual is referring to double knitting in a sort of shorthand form. Because if you look through the rest of the book and the directions in this book, there are very few pictures, there are very few directions. It's not a book that a lot of the knitting manuals you'll find on archive.org claim to be very comprehensive and make a strong effort, at least, to show how to do a few basic stitches and explanations of that. This book does not include any of that. It is very much for someone who already knows how to knit and is just giving ideas and general project vibes. So, in conclusion, knit 30 rows, putting the wool twice round the pin, I believe, is a shorthand for double knitting because there is no other knit stitch that uses that terminology and uses that putting the wool twice round the pin. If it was a yarn over of some sort, there are other books that explain different types of terminology for yarning over. This makes no sense other than in the context of she is asking us to double knit. And with that, we can get into knitting. What I am pretty sure at this point is a 3-tiered bustle pad with a double knit base of each layer as well as a ribbed border at the top, which will then be sewn together, layered up, and put on a little bit of cotton tape. Woohoo! Okay, jumping right into it, you're going to need some sort of cotton tape or ribbon to tie your bustle to your body. I just tied mine with a little knot and then I put that under my corset hook. However, if you're going to be wanting to tie it to itself and you don't want the bulk, you may want to use like an extra button or something, or a hook. And then for the needles, your smaller ones will want to be a US size 4 and your larger ones you'll want a US 10.5, in accordance to the Eagle size guide being translated to US needle sizes. And I have circulars and straights. It doesn't matter which ones you use, I just didn't have straights in 10.5. But of course it would have been more historically accurate to use straights for both. And then as for the yarn itself, it asks for 8 ply, which translates in modern day to DK weight yarn. And it did ask for super fleecy. Mine is a cotton yarn, so it is not the most fluffy and fleecy out there. However, you know, we make do, we use what we have. And as for amounts, I would say I used about 250 yards, or 250 meters or so of the yarn. And then the final thing you may want, if you, like me, cannot count to save your life, are some stitch markers, but as I literally only use them on the 2x2 ribbing. So if you trust yourself to count while doing a simple ribbing, good on you. Not for me, not today. So I used a long tail cast on, and since I tend to cast on quite tightly, I doubled my needles up. However, you can also do your cast on just on larger needles. I could have cast on to my circulars. However, they were just a bit too short, shorter than I was comfortable with for casting on. So we start just with the doubling of the needles, and there are all my stitch markers. I did them every 10 stitches out of the 60. So you've got 5 stitch markers there separating them out. And then when you double your needles for a cast on, you just take one out, and then you've got a nice, loose, easy to work into stitch. And I had not knit in quite a while, I will tell you, so I am not any sort of expert. I did sharpen up, polish up my skills a bit through this project, so my ribbing was quite a lot neater and faster towards the end. But here you can kind of see me just flailing around, trying to remember how to keep the tension without readjusting every 5 seconds. And if I'm knitting in a style that you haven't seen before, this is just continental, by the way, which, I recommend, versus English style, which is what I was taught through YouTube videos to begin with. But then when I went to a class on how to knit with lace charts, she couldn't remember how to purl in English style, and I couldn't remember either. So she just taught me continental so that I could learn how to purl. And I found continental knitting and purling so simple. And this is just a 2x2 ribbing, again, so 2 knits, 2 purls all the way across for each side. And then you'll do 6 rows of that. And for me, 60 stitches of ribbing in 6 rows. It took about 5 to 10 minutes per row, but your mileage will vary. However, I will say I'm pretty low level in terms of knitting speed. Now, after you've got your 6 rows of the ribbing, I was quite nervous about trying the double knitting as I'd never done it before. So what I decided to do was just put myself a lifeline just so I didn't lose. I mean, it was hardly an hour of knitting, but still, lifelines for life, guys. Just put one in. It can't hurt to do it. And what you do is you literally just take your yarn needle and you run a string through the loops as they're on the hook. Don't wrap around anything, just straight through. And then if you ever need to pull back or you lose some stitches, you can just pull it all back to where the lifeline is, and you'll know none of the stitches have been twisted or anything, and you can just restart. So for the first panel,
Every single panel starts with 6 rows of ribbing, but then it's a different amount of rows of the double knitting. So we're starting here, we're gonna have to do 30 rows for the biggest piece. And for double knitting, your setup row looks slightly different from the rest of your rows, but all of them start with a knit 1 as your first stitch and a knit 1 as your last stitch. And then the sequence in between is as follows. So you're going to bring your yarn forward as if to purl. Now I'm doing this in the continental style again. It might look a little different for English style. But instead of wrapping or purling, you are just going to slip the stitch onto your larger needle, as this is a setup row, right? So we're switching from the smaller needle to the larger needle. And then for the next stitch, the notorious double knit wrap twice. So you're going to wrap it twice within a single knit stitch. So then that's going to bring what looks like 2 stitches onto your next needle. And that's why this setup row is going to look different than all the rest of the rows you do, because you'll see there's going to be 2 loops per 1 double knit stitch that you've done in the last row. So looking at this, once we're onto the bigger needles, you're knitting 1 as your start, then you're slipping, and you're slipping both of those loops off. And then you're doing your double knit, wrapping twice. And then you're slipping both of the loops off, and then you're double knitting, wrapping twice. And then when you go back and do this for the opposite row, what you'll be doing is you'll be slipping the double knits, and you'll be knitting the slipped stitch. So it'll be a big long stitch that you double knit, and then you'll be slipping the double wrap. And I hope that makes sense. If not, just keep rewatching the video or read through some of the manuals. And so I would say for me, I did time this again, it was about 5.5 minutes per row is what I averaged. So calculate that over the course of 30 rows, a good amount of time, enough time to read 3.5 Chronicles of Narnia. And now we can finally solve the mystery of what the heck double knitting looks like. And so between the very large needles and the doubling and dropping stitches of the rows, you basically just create a really big loose stitch. It's not going to look super pretty because it's quite hard to control the tension. At least for me, I'm sure someone could have figured it out a bit better than I did, but it's very squishy. And here you see, that's why it's called double knitting, because you've literally got 2 layers. So the stitch you're dropping in each row, because you're dropping every other stitch, and then you're just knitting it in the next row. And that's what makes that double layering, and it is super plush, and I absolutely love it. So now we are going into the takedown row, and we're taking off all those double knits, but we're not replacing them with new double knits where we're wrapping the yarn twice. So knit 1, slip, but then we're just going straight into knit 1, slip. So we're not replacing any of the extra looping. We're going to take this down, and we're going to end with our normal 60 stitches that we started with. And I will say, for this first tier, I ended up doing the 30 rows and then doing a takedown row to take it back down to 50, to 60, sorry. So it was technically 31 rows, but for the other tiers, I did the last row as the breakdown row. So it really doesn't matter quite how you do it in a project like this, but either way technically works. And here we are back at our happy 60 stitches on the needles, and we're going to be able to do a super stretchy cast off now. I would recommend looking at tutorials for this on YouTube, as that's what I did, and I was not particularly fantastic at it. And it's quite fiddly, in my opinion. I did not have a good time doing this cast off, but you're going to want to make sure you do a stretchier cast off, as the double knitting is quite flexible and malleable. But really, you just knit 2 stitches onto your right needle, if you're knitting left to right, and then you just knit those 2 together. See, because with normal bind offs, like the first cast off that you usually learn, it will be knit 2, and then like slip the first one over the second one. But with this, instead of slipping it, you knit them together, and so you create like a third stitch in there. And so I got a lot better at it towards the end, but it still is a fiddly stitch to do, I will say. So you're going to want to watch a tutorial or 2 on that. I'm sorry I couldn't provide quite the most comprehensive way to do that particular stretchy bind off. But anyways, as you finish it off, just cut the tail end and try not to pull too hard on this, as you will warp the fabric just a bit. I mean, it'll stretch back into position, but as this isn't really something that I would block personally, you just want to make sure you're not warping things too much out of shape, as you're not really gonna reshape them in the end if you're me. But hey, maybe you will. So then it's just time to weave in those ends, the part everyone loves. I didn't particularly mind it for this project. However, I will say anything involving color work makes me want to curl up in a ball and cry. But weave your ends in, guys. It's not that bad. Although it was a little bit bad on the bottom bit, because it's just such a loose weave that there's really nothing for the ends to definitively catch into. So you kind of got to work your way along the edges as best as you can. And then, drum roll please, it was finished! You have your first row, then do it all again, but this time for 26 rows instead of 30 rows of the double knitting. And then you'll do it one more time, 18 rows instead of the 26. And I will say, this is a very good one for those of us who suffer from second sock syndrome, because it just gets shorter and faster and shorter and faster. So the last row really felt so quick. I did it in under 3 hours, definitely. And then after that, you'll just want to seam them together. I seam them with my yarn needle, and I did it in a tiered format, so you just the top of one ribbing to the bottom of another, as you can see here. And then I took my cotton tape and I inserted it into the sides, just finding a little hole in the ribbing to do that by. So I do recommend quite a thin, flexible cotton tape, nothing like a Petersham or anything, just to make sure you're not adding any extra bulk and that it goes well into the small hole of the ribbing without distorting anything too much. Then I just sewed up the edges, as this is cotton, it wasn't going to melt down on the edges or anything. And as you can see, you just fold it over 2 times, seam it up, and then fold it over itself.
All right, are we ready? Ta-da! Here she is! Absolutely gorgeous. So soft and plush. Super quick to make. 2-3 days. I ended up going through about 4 audiobooks in the time frame, but they were Narnia. I'm going through that right now, so I would say altogether probably 15-ish hours. And it measures about 10 inches long, as well as 10 inches across about. However, because I didn't run the ribbon all the way across the top, she does have a good bit of stretch to her. So without further ado, those are all of my underthings over there. Let's get this tried on.
So I am talking up a storm here because I thought I had the audio or the mic turned on my phone. However, I did not, tragically. So I'm just explaining my corset because I never made a video for it because it was a university project and I was just too stressed within the time frame to create a full video. But it's mid-Victorian. It's modeled after riding corsets. It has cording. It's quite flexible. And that is the corset hook that I have that, you just tuck your ties underneath. And then that's also what I use to tuck the bustle pad underneath. And that's why I didn't do any sort of button or hook to hold it together right at the waist because it's just easier to tuck it under the corset hook. And oh my gosh, she's gorgeous. She's amazing. I need to pull her further down because I don't need her half up my back, but you know how it is. It's all right. She's adjustable. And I absolutely loved this project. I will say it was so inspiring to me to be able to read a knitting manual from 1847 and actually create something from it. I am creating something with the same directions that some girl from the 1850s would have been looking at. I mean, it's fantastic. And one thing I really like about the tier format is that the edges flare out a bit, but since it's tiered, they kind of flare over each other and there's no harsh edge. It kind of just softly ends and tapers off. Now, of course, there's a moment of truth where we see it's cute, but does it actually work? And I will say, obviously, there is no use for this bustle pad in the 1880s. It is a very tame, subtle girly. However, for 1840s day wear, I think it is absolutely fantastic. Here's a side by side, left is without the bustle pad, right is with, and I think it does the job. But obviously, I do want a second opinion, so be sure to tell me in the comments how you think the bustle pad turned out. Would you wear it?
And that's all for today. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. And if you're interested in seeing other projects like this, things usually historically inspired, I would love it if you could subscribe to my channel. I'm also quite active on Instagram and TikTok if you're interested in short form content. And I hope to see you all again soon.